Hello history people. Today, we're going to explore the Battle of Mutah, one of the earliest battles in Islam, but from a new perspective. To give some context, the Battle of Mutah took place around 8 years after the hijrah of the Prophet Muhammad from Mecca to Medina. It occurred near Mutah, a village east of the Jordan River. This was the first major confrontation between the emerging Islamic State and the Byzantine Empire, making it a crucial moment in history, one whose impact would be felt for generations to come. So, let's begin with the big question: what was the geopolitical environment in which this battle took place? At this time, we have an emerging Islamic State led by the Prophet Muhammad in Medina. On the other side, there is a tribal opposition in Mecca, led by Abu Sufyan, a key figure of the Banu Umayyah clan. However, this opposition was not actively at war with Medina, as both sides were in a state of truce following the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, which had been established about 2 years before the battle. To the north of Medina, the early Islamic State had established firm control over Khaybar, a major oasis town that was captured about a year before Mutah. This was a significant gain for the growing state. Khaybar was only the beginning of a series of settlements along the route toward Jordan and Syria that would later come under Islamic influence, with Tayma being one of the final key points along that path. Beyond these areas, near the borders of Jordan and southern Syria, were the Ghassanids, a Christian Arab dynasty that served as a Byzantine client state. They were loyal to the Byzantine Empire and acted as a buffer between Arabia and Byzantium. The Ghassanids were indeed a group of Azdi tribes which originates in Yemen. That, according to early records, immigrated after the Great Flood of Aram. They settled in different regions, some in Yathrib, which became Medina, to form Aws and Khazraj, the main tribes that later supported the Prophet. Some settled in Jordan to become the Ghassanids, others in Oman, and 2 branches, Azd Shanua and Azd Dawes, stayed in Yemen. Here, we now know approximately what political entities existed around the time of the battle. So the next question is, what actually made this battle begin? According to known records and the mainstream narrative, after the peace treaty, the Prophet sought to invite surrounding tribes and kingdoms to Islam. So he sent messengers to various chiefs and rulers across the region. Like any other political entity, a messenger was decided to be sent to the Ghassanids. Their main capital was Basra. The messenger chosen was from the Az tribes in Medina and one of the early converts, named Al-Harith bin Umair al-Azdi. He was intended to go to Al-Harith bin Abi Shamir al-Ghassani. But he was intercepted before that by Shurabil bin Amr al-Ghassani, the governor of the neighboring district of al-Balqa, in a town named Mutah, which later gave its name to the battle. Shurabil stopped him and asked, "Where are you heading?" When Al-Harith replied that he was going to Syria, Shurabil asked, "Perhaps you are one of the messengers of Muhammad?" Al-Harith boldly confirmed, "Yes, I am the messenger of Allah, peace be upon him." Upon this confirmation, Shurabil ordered that Al-Harith be bound tightly. In what would be considered a severe violation of diplomatic norms, he was then brought forward and executed by beheading. And here is where the reason behind the Battle of Mutah becomes clear. Or at least according to the common popular opinion. We know that news of the killing of the messenger reached Medina, and the Prophet and the leaders were greatly grieved. According to old traditions, killing a messenger was considered a declaration of war and required an immediate response. So what actually happened in Medina, and how were the preparations for the battle carried out? The story tells us that the army assembled at Al-Jurf, a traditional military staging ground located a few miles north of Medina on the way to Syria. Gathering outside the city allowed the Prophet to organize the ranks and inspect the troops without the congestion of the city streets. The army that gathered at Al-Jurf numbered around 3,000 fighters. This was the largest force the Muslims had ever sent on a Sariya, an expedition not personally led by the Prophet. The mobilization was swift. The killing of the messenger was seen as a major violation of diplomatic norms, and the response had to be immediate, before the Ghassanids could further strengthen their position along the border. As the army assembled, the Prophet established a unique chain of command, something not recorded in previous expeditions. He appointed Zayd bin Haritha as the first leader. If Zayd were to fall, Ja'far bin Abi Talib would take command. If Ja'far fell, then Abdullah bin Rawaha would lead. And if all three were lost, the soldiers were instructed to choose a leader from among themselves. Before departure, the Prophet also gave clear instructions that balanced warfare with strict ethical limits. They were to go first to the place where Al-Harith was killed and invite the people there to Islam. They were not to harm women, children, or the elderly, nor destroy homes or cut down trees, including date palms. Monks and people in places of worship were also not to be harmed. When the army finally set out, the Prophet walked with them to Thaniyat al-Wada, the Valley of Farewell. The people of Medina gathered in large numbers to see them off, many of them emotional, knowing the army was heading toward the frontier of the Byzantine Empire. As they departed, the soldiers reassured the crowd, saying, "May Allah bring us back to you in safety." Among them, Abdullah bin Rawaha reportedly responded with poetry, expressing that his true wish was martyrdom and forgiveness. Here come a lot of questions that make this version feel unusual. Why was this a Sariya and not a Ghazwa? Why was such a large army sent without the Prophet himself leading it, especially when just a year earlier at Khaybar he led around 1,400 men? And before that, smaller expeditions of about 100 men were typically sent without this scale of mobilization. First question pinned on our screen. Here, we could possibly have two very logical explanations. First, it may have been intended as an action directed only against the regional ruler of al-Balqa, not against the entire Ghassanid authority or the Byzantine Empire as a whole. In that case, it would have been a limited response, requiring only a relatively small force. This interpretation is supported by the idea that there was no declared war with Byzantium at this stage. In fact, it is reported that the Byzantine emperor had previously received a messenger of the Prophet and even responded with gestures of respect and gifts as an act of peace. So under this view, there was no full-scale war with Byzantium, and not even with the Ghassanids as a whole, only a response to the governor of al-Balqa. And in line with the Prophet's role as a leader of diplomacy and restraint, the action would not have gone beyond that limited scope. In that view, the 3,000 men were more than enough for a limited operation, or the number itself may even be exaggerated in later chronicles. Because sending such a large force without the Prophet leading it himself against a major empire was not something commonly done or repeated, except in the later expedition of Usama ibn Zayd, which is also connected to the aftermath of Mutah. The second view is that the Prophet could not leave Medina at that time due to internal instability and possible hidden political threats developing within the region. In this interpretation, the situation required caution. Medina was still a young state that had recently strengthened itself through the acquisition of Khaybar, a major Jewish settlement with significant economic and strategic importance. At the same time, it was maintaining a fragile peace with Mecca under the leadership of the Banu Umayyah. We'll leave it to the viewer's intelligence to connect these points. From this perspective, sending the Prophet himself on a distant campaign against a powerful frontier region like the Ghassanid sphere would have created serious strategic risk. So the decision to send an expedition without his direct participation becomes understandable in terms of state security and political balance. Another interpretation is the possibility of internal instability in Medina, including a potential risk of unrest or internal challenges to authority. In this view, Abu Sufyan and the Quraysh, after years of direct confrontation, may have shifted from open warfare to a more indirect strategy following the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. Instead of direct battles, the focus could have moved toward influence, alliances, and attempts to weaken the emerging Islamic state from within. From this perspective, what we see is not just external pressure from Byzantium and its allies, but also a more subtle political environment surrounding Medina itself. This helps explain why a large expedition was sent, but without the Prophet leading it personally. To sum up, why such a large number without the Prophet leading? Either it was a small force aimed only at al-Balqa, or there was concern over a possible internal coup attempt in Medina, requiring the Prophet to remain in place. A second question arises in this version of events, the chain of command consisting of three commanders. This was something that had never been done before, nor repeated afterward. So why were 3 commanders appointed for this battle? That is a major question. I can't really find a clear logical argument for the 3-tier chain of command. In warfare, when a commander falls, armies can typically retreat and send a message back to Medina asking for a new appointment. So why prepare a structure where succession is already predetermined? And if the Prophet was truly sending a force to face Ghassanids, Lakhmids, other Arab groups, or even Byzantine-linked forces, why only 3,000 men? One would expect a much larger preparation. This also raises another question: the value of the commanders chosen. These were not minor figures, they were among the most important leaders of the early community. So why structure the expedition in this specific way? This 3-tier chain of command raises a major question, until we look at the profiles of the 3 commanders who were sent, their significance, and what would become their final mission. The first commander is Zayd, and in many ways he is the least surprising choice. Zayd bin Haritha was already one of the most trusted military leaders of the Prophet. During this period, he had led several expeditions, including missions such as Al-Qarada, Al-Jumam, and Al-Ashara. In terms of leadership experience, he had the most command mileage of any companion at the time. The Prophet's trust in him was so strong that it is often reported that whenever Zayd was sent on an expedition, he was appointed as its commander. So his selection to lead the first phase at Mutah was not unexpected, it aligned with his established role as a primary field commander. Zayd was also closely connected to the Prophet personally. He had been raised in the Prophet's household before prophethood and remained one of the earliest and most trusted members of his inner circle during the early revelation period. He is often described in early tradition as among the earliest converts to Islam, after Khadija and Ali. This deep personal bond, along with his military experience, further explains the level of trust placed in him as a commander. So far, everything makes sense. The first choice is logical and expected. But things become far more interesting when we look at the profiles of the other 2 men. The second commander is Ja'far ibn Abi Talib, the cousin of the Prophet. Before Mutah, Ja'far had spent around 13 years in Abyssinia, modern-day Ethiopia and Eritrea. He was not simply a refugee there, he served as the leader and spokesperson of the Muslim community in exile. During that time, he played a key diplomatic role. One of his most famous moments was when the Quraysh sent envoys to the Negus, the ruler of Abyssinia, attempting to convince him to expel the Muslims. Ja'far stood before the court and delivered a powerful speech explaining the transformation from the pre-Islamic period to Islam. He also recited verses from Surah Maryam about the birth of Jesus, which deeply moved the Christian king and contributed to the Muslims being granted protection. In practice, Ja'far effectively led the Muslim community in Abyssinia. He managed their affairs, helped organize their daily life, and maintained their religious practice in a foreign land under a just non-Muslim ruler. During this period, he also built a family, and his children were born there. His presence in Abyssinia is also tied to one of the earliest peaceful expansions of Islam beyond Arabia. According to tradition, the Negus eventually accepted Islam, and when he passed away, the Prophet later performed the funeral prayer for him in absentia. Ja'far eventually returned to Medina around the time of the conquest of Khaybar. The Prophet is reported to have shown great joy upon his return, expressing deep happiness at seeing him again after so many years. So there is something striking here. Ja'far returns after 13 years of safety in Abyssinia, only to be martyred at Mutah about a year later. So Ja'far was a diplomat, and one of the most experienced figures in the early Muslim community, as well as a close family member of the Prophet. So why appoint him as a military commander in such a high-risk battle? And why place someone with that level of diplomatic and historical importance in a military operation that carried such heavy danger? The third commander was Abdullah ibn Rawaha, one of the Ansar of Medina and a well-known poet in the early Muslim community. He had experience in smaller operations and administrative roles, including duties connected to Khaybar, a major Jewish majority oasis settlement that had come under Muslim control. However, he was not known as a major battlefield commander on the same level as others. There is also a reported expedition involving Abdullah ibn Rawaha and a very small group, around 30 men, sent toward Khaybar to engage in negotiation with a local leader. During that encounter, tensions escalated into a violent clash, resulting in the death of the opposing party and his men, while the Muslim side reportedly suffered no losses. So while Abdullah ibn Rawaha was respected for his faith, poetry, and service, his background was more limited in large-scale military leadership compared to others. So why send a poet and a skilled administrative tax collector as a leader in this situation? And even in terms of military experience, there were other figures available, such as Ali ibn Abi Talib and Muhammad bin Maslama, who had more direct experience in combat. And why were Khalid ibn al-Walid and the leaders of Banu Makhzum not appointed? They were among the most skilled military figures of the Quraysh-linked clans. If this was expected to be such a large-scale confrontation, why were they not placed in command from the beginning? So to summarize, we have around 3,000 men heading toward a region associated with Ghassanid forces, Christian Arab tribes, and Byzantine influence. The army is led by a chain of 3 commanders, one clearly established as a seasoned military leader, one primarily known for administrative and tax responsibilities, and one best known as a diplomat. Meanwhile, other highly skilled commanders such as Ali ibn Abi Talib were still in Medina, and the Prophet himself did not lead the expedition despite its scale. Taken together, it raises an unusual strategic picture that invites further questions about the decision-making behind this campaign. If we take the first speculation, that the expedition was limited in scope and that the Prophet remained in Medina due to potential internal instability, then one possible argument is that key figures like Ali ibn Abi Talib were kept in Medina to maintain internal stability and protect the center of authority. That could explain his absence from the expedition. But even then, another question remains: why appoint a diplomat and a tax administrator as part of the chain of military command? Then we move into the events on the ground. The Muslim army advanced until it reached Ma'an, a settlement in the region. There, they received intelligence that they were facing approximately 100,000 Byzantine troops, reinforced by another 100,000 Arab tribal allies such as Lakhm, Judham, and others. Facing odds of roughly 200,000 against 3,000, the army halted for 2 nights to deliberate. Some within the ranks suggested sending a message back to Medina to request reinforcements or new instructions. Here another question arises: why are there no detailed records naming those who supported or opposed sending a message back to Medina, and why do we have limited detail about the consultation itself? The sources do not preserve a full account of that council or list the individuals involved in each opinion. What we have instead are broad narrations of deliberation within the army, without a detailed breakdown of the discussion or its participants. This lack of detail leaves room for interpretation, but also makes it difficult to reconstruct the exact dynamics of that decision-making moment. The only detailed moment recorded from that consultation is the turning point led by Abdullah ibn Rawaha. He broke the deadlock by reminding the army of their purpose, saying that they had not come relying on numbers or strength, but for the sake of their faith. He urged them to proceed forward, declaring, "We do not fight with numbers or strength, but with this religion. Proceed. One of the 2 beauties awaits us, victory or martyrdom." A lot of fog in the situation, right? Then the real battle took place over approximately 1 day. During the late morning and afternoon, the main fighting broke out. Zayd, Jafar, and Abdullah ibn Rawaha were all martyred in succession. At that moment, Thabit bin Arqam took hold of the banner and called out for the army to choose a new leader. The soldiers unanimously chose Khalid ibn al-Walid. This marked his first command as a Muslim. By nightfall, Khalid reorganized the army and began implementing tactical and psychological measures to stabilize the situation and manage the enemy's perception of strength. So the question is, what was Khalid's plan that changed the course of the entire situation? Khalid ibn al-Walid realized that a conventional victory was no longer possible. So he shifted the focus from direct engagement to controlled withdrawal. During the night, he reorganized the army in a way that created the impression of change and reinforcement. He shifted units so that the right wing moved to the left, and the left to the right, while the rear guard was brought to the front. He also ordered cavalry movements behind nearby terrain to generate dust and noise, while the soldiers increased their battle cries, creating the impression of a much larger force. By the following day, the opposing forces observed what appeared to be a reorganized and expanded army. Combined with the dust and movement, it created the impression that reinforcements had arrived from Medina. Concerned about a potential trap, the opposing commanders hesitated to launch a full assault. Khalid used this hesitation to begin a gradual and controlled withdrawal. The opposing forces, uncertain whether they were being drawn into deeper desert territory, did not pursue aggressively. Khalid ultimately led the 3,000 men back safely to Medina. In the end, according to Muslim chronicles, only around 12 Muslims were killed, including the 3 commanders. Here, another question arises: why were only around 12 Muslims killed, and why did the Byzantine forces not pursue and attempt to completely destroy the remaining army, especially given the reported imbalance of around 200,000 against 3,000 under a new command? One interpretation is that this entire mission may not have been aimed at achieving a full-scale battlefield victory, but rather a more limited objective, targeting key figures and assassinating them. Well, now I will present a reimagined version of what potentially really happened at Mutah, one that could be more logical, both politically and militarily. After Hudaybiyah Treaty was signed, we said that Banu Umayyah, mainly led by Abu Sufyan, were trying to find an internal possible coup d'état. They wanted to regain their power over Arabia and trade. But now Medina and the Muslims were too strong to fight against. Here they needed allies to begin their internal revolt. They were in a good relationship with Byzantium to the north through old trade partnerships. Even Heraclius had once invited Abu Sufyan to question him about the Prophet. In this view, they may have worked to involve the Byzantines by encouraging support in resources and military assistance, with the idea that if they regained control, Arabia could remain a client state aligned with Byzantium. And they also needed support from within. In this interpretation, attention turns to the Jewish community of Khaybar, which had recently been incorporated into the Islamic State. In this interpretation, this formed a kind of triple alignment working in the background, a network of interests that aimed to regain influence and power from the Prophet's emerging state. Now Mutah, in this interpretation, could be seen as their first masterpiece. But how? This alliance was sure that the Prophet is not going to lose during his life. It was prophecy and terrain evidence. So they needed to infiltrate post his death. Now they see how this is possible. Banu Umayyah won't get the rule. That won't be easy because of their rival with the Muslims. So the succession will be in another clan. Well, there were 2 potential political entities that could lead after the Prophet's death. The Hashemite and the Prophet's close family, led by Ali, Zayd, Hassan, and Hussein. The other clans like Banu Adi and Banu Taym, led by figures like Abu Bakr, Umar, and Khalid, and other minor clans. Here the Umayyads and their alliance posed a question: whose succession is more favorable to us? They saw that the Hashemite would fight and would be very strict with the Banu Umayyad, even if many of them had entered Islam. As a clan, they would likely continue their exclusion from political life. But the other Bakrite, we could say, group could be infiltrated later on and negotiated with. I know what you might be thinking: this looks familiar. Yes, my friend, this is where the seeds of the first Fitna begin to appear. Now to Mutah. What did they really do there, and what parts of the accounts were preserved in history, and what parts were probably omitted or not fully recorded? The story of the messenger being sent to the Ghassanids is true. It is also true that Shurabil killed the messenger, with the order of the Triple Alliance. But what was sent to Medina was something different. In this interpretation, the messenger's words were used to construct a different narrative, and a letter was allegedly presented to Medina suggesting that the Ghassanids had entered Islam, were seeking military protection against the Byzantines, and were requesting diplomatic support, with references to jizya or tax acceptation. Through this letter, the intention would have been to make Medina believe that a form of submission to Islamic authority had taken place. Using this, the Prophet was already aware that there were hidden hands at play, and he had concerns about Medina's internal situation. However, if the message received had been true, it would have represented a major victory, bringing the Ghassanids under the Islamic State, and potentially encouraging many northern Arab tribes to enter Islam. So why did the Prophet stay in Medina? According to the letter, it did not suggest a major war or immediate large-scale danger in that mission. It presented the situation as a limited arrangement, securing support with the Ghassanids, possibly even against the Byzantines, rather than a full confrontation. So in this interpretation, staying in Medina to manage internal stability and potential conspiracies would have been the wiser decision. Why 3,000? Because the Ghassanid lands were sparse, and that number was needed to cover the terrain. But also not more than that, because if there was any confrontation with the Byzantines, the Ghassanids would be on the Muslim side. In that sense, it was a defensive mission. He appointed his best general, Zayd, for this mission. Why three-tier chain of command? There wasn't such thing. He only appointed Zayd as a military commander. There was no three-tier chain of command, but rather everyone had a specific task. Jafar was chosen to negotiate with Heraclius, because he needed someone experienced in dealing with similar rulers. He could not find a better man for that than someone who had spent 13 years in Ethiopia. Finally, Ibn Rawaha was sent as a tax collector, someone familiar with the northern regions and taxation systems, having already worked for many years in Khaybar. In this interpretation, the targeting of these three figures becomes a key objective of the Triple Alliance. So the question is, why these three specifically? As I told you, the alliance saw that either the Hashemite or the Bakrite would have control after the Prophet, and they saw more opportunity in Bakrite control. So they needed to weaken Hashemite leaders who could potentially take the rule after the Prophet. This, in this interpretation, includes Zayd, the adopted son, Jafar, and any allied companions to the Hashemite. Also, in this view, concerns would extend to Ali. By this assassination of the Hashemite party, they created a vacuum so that the Bakrite could take more politically important roles. Zayd was the first military leader, no doubt. By eliminating him and planning for Khalid to take the leadership flag, they indirectly replaced the military leadership from the Hashemite to the Bakrite party. And this is why the Byzantine didn't trail the fleeing army. And so, the Byzantines acted accordingly, with the Ghassanids being the luring side. Jafar was also a strong Hashemite-linked figure in foreign relations, so his removal would also fit within that framework. Finally, Ibn Rawaha was likewise seen as aligned with the Hashemite side and was involved in managing taxation in Khaybar, the Jewish majority region that was part of the broader geopolitical alliance previously discussed. By Mutah, the planning was turning into action. The Triple Alignment began preparing for a potential return of Umayyad influence to power. And this was only the beginning of a long conspiracy that led to the first Fitna and the rise of the Umayyads. If you liked this video, subscribe, like, and share it with your history friends. Stay tuned as we continue to look at history from new lenses.